Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here. We're going to start. So my name is Benjamin Hoffman. I'm an associate professor of French literature and the director of OSU's Center of Excellence. Today I have the real pleasure of introducing Professor Bruno Perreau from the MIT, who is going to give a presentation today about his latest publication, Sphère d'injustice pour un universalisme minoritaire. Before presenting our guests, I would like to take a moment to thank the various people and institutions that made today's visit possible. Many thanks to the Department of French and Italian, especially to our chair, Professor Sagres Heller, for supporting this event in countless ways. I also wish to thank Matt Lang and Jennifer House for their relentless work on behalf of the Center of Excellence, as well as the French Cultural Services in the United States, and especially the French Consulate in Chicago, for providing us the financial and logistic support we needed. This event is also supported by a number of departments and centers at Ohio State. African American and African Studies, History of Art, Spanish and Portuguese, Germanic languages and literatures, Slavic and Eastern European, the Humanities Institute, and the Center for Languages, Literatures and Cultures. And last but not least, I'd like to take a moment to thank the private donors who are supporting our lecture series, as well as our Jules Verne Writing Residency. We feel absolutely privileged to receive contributions that allow us to bring acclaimed authors and scholars on campus in order to make the best of French and Francophone culture available for the members of our community. At the end of this event, please stay for a short reception in honor of our guests. So Bruno Perreau is the Cynthia L. Reid Professor of French Studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a faculty affiliate at the Center for European Studies at Harvard. Bruno Perreau received his PhD in political science from the University of Paris, Panthéon-Sorbonne, and taught at Sciences Po and the University of Paris, Val-de-Marne. He was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, a research associate at the University of Cambridge, a fellow at Stanford Humanities Center, a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. He received numerous awards, in particular from the British Academy, the European Commission, the European University Institute, the French government, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Perreau is the founding member of the MIT Global France Seminar and the France Plus initiative, now a Center of Excellence in French and Francophone Studies. He is the author of 12 books on French politics, bioethics, family policies, queer theory, and minority law, among which the politics of... Playing with me? Okay. The Politics of Adoption, Queer Theory, The French Response, Les défis de la République, Qui a peur de la théorie queer, the Oxford Encyclopedia of LGBT Politics and Policy, and finally, Sphère d'injustice pour un universalisme minoritaire. His most recent book is under contract with MIT Press with an expected publication. Again, I'm not touching anything. Okay. With an expected publication in March 2025. Finally, Perreau is the author of about 30 articles and book chapters focused on LGBT politics, reactionary movements, contemporary French literature, and critical social theory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bruno Perreau to Ohio State. It's an honor to have him with us today.
All right, can you hear me well enough? Perfect. Thank you very much for your kind words, Benjamin, and for initiating and spearheading this invitation. I rarely say that, but I truly mean it. Ohio State is very lucky to have you, the broad range of your expertise and energy is really worthy of admiration. So thank you very much for having me. You've already thanked many people, so I won't obviously thank each and every sponsor, but I'm really glad to be here. And I interacted with a few people, Jennifer Eilis, Matthew Lang, Matteo Young, who was my chaperone today, of course the team of French press, so I'm really thankful to be here and have the opportunity to present this book that you have here, Spheres of Injustice. As you said, the book was published in French first in October last year. It's being translated into English, and it's expected in the spring, so probably March 2025 at MIT Press. And I'm starting with this because this is a conversation that we already had with a few people today. The notion of universalism, so universalism, is not necessarily very compatible with the social theory, legal and political theory in the US. So the title will probably be different in English. If we're sticking to the plan, it should be the ethical promise of minority presence, which you will probably discover through this talk. So thank you again for having me. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to present the book. Because of who I am, especially my French accent, my experience shows that reading a paper is not necessarily the best approach to prevent people from falling asleep. So what I'm going to do is to actually try and talk to you as much as possible, and maybe I'll come to a more formal conclusion eventually. I'll do a few things today. I will start by presenting the context, the genesis of the book, so to speak, so the reason for which I wrote this book. Then I'll say a few words about its overall argument, give you a sense of its architecture, and then eventually, depending on the time left, so I'll have to be cautious, I'll focus on two particular aspects, legal analogies, and indeed the question of a minority ethic. So let's start with the context. Why did I start working on theories of justice, and how this tweak, which consists in approaching theories of justice from the perspective of injustice. It's actually a request from colleagues. Sometimes your colleagues know better. Sometimes, not always. So two of my colleagues in France, Charles Beauvieux and Véronique Mautier, edited this book, Genre, droit et politique, so gender, law, and politics. And they asked me to write a paper. And they asked me this about 10 years after I left France. I used to teach constitutional law and political theory and sociology in France, as well as different classes in LGBT and gender studies. And I'm now a professor of French studies, so in a humanities department, which means that my corpus has sort of changed a little bit when I crossed the ocean. And so I basically said, no, I'm sorry, there's no way I can write a paper for your book. And they, of course, insisted. I said no again. They insisted, and I gave up and accepted. So then I had to find something to write about. And I remembered one case, which is mentioned here, from the European, I left that in French, sorry about that. The European Court, now it's the European Court of Justice, the Grant versus Southwest Trains case, which was a very interesting case, where a woman worked for a train company, and her partner, so it was before gay marriage, couldn't benefit from preferential fares. You know, when you travel, you can have like discounted tickets. So they sued the company. And because sexual orientation was not well protected at the time by the European Union, they decided to use a quite unusual argument. So the attorney in particular said, rather than using sexual orientation, she used gender by saying, if this woman had been a man, she would have benefited from a preferential fare. So it was a way to use the category of gender to protect sexual orientation. In that particular case, the court didn't follow this argument, so they lost. However, it launched an entire body of jurisprudence, which I will mention. So here you can hear something which is at the heart of my book. That is to say that one given category, in the US we say protected class, can be used to protect another category, which is a way more solidarist conception of the law, where you acknowledge the fact that you are governed by the way other people are governed, which seemed to me a very important case to make in a context where there is a strong political antagonization of minorities, especially after, I'll say a few words about that later, but especially after the decision by the Supreme Court to put an end to affirmative action based on a case where Asian American students at Harvard and the University of North Carolina explained that they were discriminated against because they couldn't benefit from the system. So that was the first starting point, this idea of resonances between different protected class. The second was an old article, and also it's probably my colleague's fault. When I used to teach at Sciences Po, I started at Sciences Po when Sciences Po created its first affirmative action programs. In France, it's not based, or it's not based on ethnic or racial categories, but on territorial categories, so to speak. So it's based on the very place where you live. So high school students from underprivileged areas could benefit from an agreement with Sciences Po. Sciences Po, I didn't mention that, but it's a political science grande école, so sort of elite school, which usually prepares students to become high civil servants, journalists, and work in international relations, and of course a good number of politicians. And so Sciences Po created this new system based on the very location where underprivileged areas were. And I had these first students in my classes, and I soon became also a tutor for them. I also worked for similar programs, affirmative action programs, vis-à-vis different overseas areas in France, especially New Caledonia. So I was really at the heart of the system. And what I witnessed in my class is that the very presence of students who were not meant to become students at Sciences Po had somehow a domino effect on others. So this is something we also discussed earlier, but my students coming from small cities in the countryside suddenly felt that, well, after all, if there is another way to be selected, to be admitted to Sciences Po, maybe I should be also proud of my own trajectory. So there was this kind of domino effect, even to the point where the most privileged students started to question their very position, because it's not a universal position. It's not their responsibility either. They were not born. They were born in privileged families, and so this sort of pedagogy of reciprocity was really what I tried to foster. And my goal was to try and explain that what was important in this system, which was very much criticized at the time in France, was that the interest was the affirmative dimension of affirmative action. Because even, obviously, it's only for a tiny few, a very tiny number of people. But it plays a role, it has an impact on others, because you know that this is possible, that it is an example for people who might not even consider that for themselves. So again, a form of resonance between what benefits a certain number of students and the rest of the population. Interestingly, it's still called in France discrimination positive, so positive discrimination, which actually undermines the affirmative dimension of affirmative action. And so in this paper, I try to advocate for this affirmative dimension. A third thing that really convinced me to write about these resonances the Comité Adama, the different demonstrations by the Comité Adama, Justice pour Adama, so Justice for Adama. Adama Traoré was killed in police custody in France, suffocated to death. And her sister was here, right at the center. Assa Traoré created the next day after her brother died, a committee to know the circumstances under which her brother died. And Assa Traoré, here, so it's a long story, but I'm happy to tell more about it if you want. But Assa Traoré organized with the committee several demonstrations. This one was Place de la République, just a few days after the murder of George Floyd. And as you can see, there were different references to Black Lives Matter, obviously, slogans even written in English, and different artists actually created these kind of pieces where the face of Adama Traoré and the face of George Floyd were sort of merged. You can see that here in the 10e arrondissement by JR. Also this mural Instinct close to Paris, in the north of Paris. And also very interestingly, so there were also demonstrations, obviously in Paris, but also in other cities in France. This is one in Montpellier. Again, you have direct references to Black Lives Matter. Interestingly, these connections, transatlantic connections, were immediately denied in public debate. It started with very conservative police trade union, Alliance, which demonstrated before the Bobigny court about the murals which I showed here, the one here, saying that it was a way to compare cases that shouldn't be compared, and even the Minister of the Interior at the time criticized the shameful conflation of racism, violence, and police forces. Once again, claiming that France was not the US. So there are, of course, a few things that can be said about the way police forces are organized in France and in the US. Of course, the number of weapons circulating in France is absolutely cannot be compared in any way to the circulation of weapons in the US. Segregation is not sort of organized, so to speak, in the same way. However, they were missing the point. The point was that any black person, whether living in Paris, in Clermont-Ferrand, in Berlin, in Chicago, or in Minneapolis, could have been killed by the police and could have been in George Floyd or in Adama Traoré's place. The murals were also vandalized a few days later. So, and again, talking about the reverberations of these cases of police violence and racism, you can see here Adama Traoré is mentioned on this beautiful mural in New York around Black Lives Matter. So, what I started to think about was that if we think that the common denominator of racist violence is a certain form of substitutability of black bodies, aka, as you know very well here, the fact that you can be killed when you're jogging, a kid holding a water pistol. So whatever the circumstance, you are exposed to the possibility of death. So this substitutability of black bodies is at the heart of racism, again, across borders. Now, to whom does this sort of substitutability or this possible resonance extend? And that's something that I started to work on, which is how other minority groups reacted. And starting from my experience, I couldn't help feel when George Floyd was murdered, something that echoed the mass murder in the nightclub, The Pulse in Florida, just a few years before. As a gay man, I remember very clearly how for 24 hours the mass media was very, very much denying which nightclub was actually the object of this attack. At the time, we didn't know possible terrorist connections, but it was mostly focused on the idea that it was an attack against the United States, as if anybody could have been in this nightclub, which was also a Latino nightclub. And this was also not taken into account by the press. So this form of sort of, again, resonance, echo between one experience of violence, which is certainly not the experience of racism. I would never have been arrested, plus the social background and so on and so forth, by the police in Minneapolis the way George Floyd was. However, there are other forms of violence that I experienced in my body that creates a form of connection which is not unlike what I explained from the perspective of the law, protected classes, and from the perspective of affirmative action. So that was really the starting point of the book. So to expand on this idea of substitutability, I had to think further about experiences of injustice. Injustice is, of course, the direct experience of injustice. So, indeed, legal discrimination, insult, social exclusion, violence, and so on and so forth, which is deeply inscribed in your body. But it's not only the direct experience, the lived, so to speak, experience of injustice. It's also the possibility of injustice. And injustice can have an impact on your life even if you don't experience it. If, let me give you a few examples. If you are a woman in public space and you know that you can face the possibility of being attacked, raped, you anticipate that. You anticipate that in the way you walk, in terms of when you go out, and so on and so forth. So even if you have not been the victim, the actual victim of a direct form of injustice, this is still part of your experience, and it's a form of injustice as well. There is another layer, which is not only, again, the direct experience or the possibility of injustice, but also the fact to witness injustice as well, which doesn't target you as a person or as a member of a group, but which is also a reminder that if you could be this person, it's what we call in France a rappel à l'ordre, that is to say, a way to remind you that you better behave because this is the very limit of under which you are controlled. And that's also a very important point for the theory that I develop, because it means that you can be part of a majority group and still have a certain form of experience of injustice. It might not be the most direct form of injustice, but you cannot not have been, you cannot not have witnessed injustice. You cannot not have experienced in your life a more, let's say, minimal form of injustice that might not be constitutive of an identity, that might not become the source of a discrimination, but it's still part of your trajectory. And my point is to say, how can we sort of use that as a basis for a form of politics, minority politics, that is powerful and that is also a form of long-term public politics. This is also probably the outcome of something completely different. I was part of an organization, ACT UP Paris, for a few years, we did many many interesting actions, including by connecting different groups. But I also saw with ACT UP, which had all kind of super powerful, visually powerful actions. So with, you will throw fake blood on people and use the ashes of people who died in public meetings to protest. The media and the local and national, members of the executive just got used to that. It's sad to say, but at some point we were facing people who say, "Oh, it's ACT UP. It's almost like some kind of folklore. It's some kind of exoticism in a way. They will do their show and we can move on." So my point here is that antagonism is key for minority politics. If you don't create a form of antagonism, you cannot exist in the public space. However, we need also other tools to activate other tools to have other forms of sort of other possibility to change norms, and it might imply to tap into these different dimensions of minority experience. So you have the overall argument, which means then that it needs to take into account the fact that protected class are essential because it protects people, literally, but that it has to be approached maybe sometimes in a more contextual way, thinking that minority is a relational concept. I'm just going to read one quote by sociologist Colette Guillaumin, French sociologist Colette Guillaumin. She wrote in an article on the notion of minority this, quote, "In certain social relationships, individuals belonging to minority groups have majority status, even if it isn't fully exercised, since it is limited by minority membership. With respect to Black Americans, all whites, be they women, workers, foreigners, Jews, are in a majority relationship. For non-citizen foreigners, all nationals, whether they are X or Z, stand in a majority relationship to them. We are therefore unable to define minorities and majority according to a symmetrical balance by a set of stable and constant characteristics." End of quote. This is a very challenging approach because in a way it's quite reassuring to think that one's identity is very well delineated, is stable, while actually things change depending on the context itself. I might be in this very context, in a very majority relation with you guys, because I'm the person speaking right now, and you're listening to me. But in other contexts, things might switch, because the modality of the interaction might be very different. So it's also a way to pay more attention to, maybe a little less attention to the notion of visibility, aka the need to be recognized by the gaze of the other, but rather to put more emphasis on the very presence. Because there's something, how to say that, something more intransitive in the notion of presence, what Derrida called the present of presence. This is what at the heart, again, of some minority struggles. Remember Queer Nation, we are here, we are queer, get used to it. No, it's not we're here, we're queer, please recognize us. It's get used to it. So it changes, of course, the dynamic as well. So I'm giving one more element on the overall argument. As you've heard already, I'm trying to, in this book, see the many ways in which our belongings resonate, and the changing and variable ways our belongings resonate. And somehow I needed to find a way to approach more transversally this question. And I found a good source in Michael Walzer's book, Spheres of Justice, hence the title of mine, Spheres of Injustice, A Defense of Pluralism and Equality. Long story short, this book is a direct response to the philosopher John Rawls' his Theory of Justice, published in 1971, which basically tries to find new ways to promote equality, morally speaking. And he had this theory, maybe you're familiar with that, of the veil of ignorance. So his idea is that in a complex society, we don't exactly know where we stand, or we don't always know where we stand, meaning that we don't always know how we are governed. So when it comes to making a choice, we should be inclined to choose the more protective option. AKA, if you have $100 to distribute between two people, the logic of roles is to say we have to choose 50-50 in case we would get nothing if it was 0-100. But of course, in real life, it doesn't work because some people can take the risk of getting 0 because they don't need the 100, and if they got it, that's great. And some people know much more than others their position in society. So that's exactly the critique that Walser developed by saying you cannot have a broad understanding of justice. You have to acknowledge the fact that justice doesn't have the same meaning in different spheres. AKA, justice might be connected to performance, competitiveness at work. It might be closely tied to solicitude in the family. It might be tied to faithfulness in interactions with friends and so on and so forth. So justice doesn't have the same meaning in different spheres. So in his vocabulary, he speaks about shared understandings about social goods. Social goods, it's basically, it could be values, it could be actual objects, it could be behaviors, all the things that constitute a given social sphere. So there might be spaces where honesty has this particular meaning and other spheres where honesty has another meaning. An object can be used in a sphere as a gift, and in another sphere, let's say a religious sphere, it might have another more sacred meaning. So he studies that, it's very concrete, he takes many examples. And his point is to try and explain that to maximize equality, the key thing is to try to avoid the advantages gained in one sphere to give you other advantages in other spheres. So it's a very realistic approach by saying we cannot prevent all inequalities, but at the very least, we have to block them so that they don't have like huge consequences. If you are privileged in the family, it shouldn't give you privileges in the workspace, for instance. There were a good number of criticism of this work. One main criticism by Susan Moller-Hawken, saying that this is too weak of a theory to tackle the problem of systemic oppression, because you basically try to contain inequalities rather than having a more ambitious form of theorizing equality. Walser responded by saying, well, of course, there's a moral minimalism for me. That is to say, we have to have minimal norms protected people against injustice. But we shouldn't be too, too drastic vis-à-vis these norms, because if so, we would prevent the emergence of other understandings which are key for minority groups. My point is that, of course, he couldn't anticipate that in 1983, but things have changed. The solution that he suggested to contain inequalities by trying to make the different social spheres as hermetic as possible is no longer possible in an era of globalization and global and virtualization of communication, obviously. So also one limit of his work is that, I'm quoting him here, our minimum morality summarizes what seems to be the most important to the greatest number of us. What touches all should be decided by a whole. And what I try to actually do and try to change his approach is by saying, how about a decision-making process centered on those mostly affected by this or that decision? So if you take one concrete example, we are in societies where rules that govern the life of foreigners are decided by citizens, people who are not foreigners. So how to imagine ways where the people most affected by a decision could be at the heart of the decision-making process. So it's still a sort of majority theory. Also, the question of pluralism is important as well, because for him it's about maximizing the possibility of choosing, and pluralism. And again, the way minorities can be diminished, it's not by necessarily reducing, it is partly, but not only, by reducing the possibility of choosing, but by denying the very idea that they can have or they can make choices. If you have, it's very frequent in France, the same criticism of this or that norm by a person with a majority vis-à-vis this particular question. This critique will be looked or considered as a way to show a certain, how to say that, a way to show a certain appreciation of the institutions, the state, and so almost an homage, a productive homage, critique, but productive homage to institutions. The same critique, the exact same critique, but critique in how to say that, critique sort of explained by or taken over by minority groups or minority persons will be considered as a threat for institutions, the state, and so on and so forth. So the very idea of responding to injustice just by maximizing choice is it's also something that doesn't take into account the fact that injustice is also epistemic. What Miranda Fricker explained in two ways by saying that it's both a testimonial injustice, so prejudices which remove credibility, and also a hermeneutic injustice, that is to say a gap in interpretative resources upstream any exchange. So the question I ask in the book, in a way, is who cannot and who can untie themselves from what they have done, what they are expected to do, and how these two questions are connected. Why are they certain individuals, because of their majority privilege, who can even do like a little, we all do illegal things, let's face it, minor, tiny little illegal things. But many of us are not accountable for that, while others are. And these questions are connected. It's not just about thinking about who is not accountable and who is accountable, who is not accountable and who is accountable, but the fact that making some people unaccountable is precisely what makes others accountable. Which is also a way to question minority relations in terms of resonances. So you have the overall argument. I don't have much time left. How much time do I have? 10 minutes, something like that? 10 more minutes. I will speed up. And please forgive me, but you won't have the formal conclusion that I had hoped to, but it's in the book, so you still have this opportunity. So what I do in the book is first to think about the notion of minority, then I present Walser's book and including the way his work was received in France. And then I tackle 4 challenges to minority politics in France and in the US. I'm going to speed up on that. But first one, the complexity of law. It's important to have, obviously, protected classes, 25 in France, 9 in the US. In France, it's even more complex because you have different branches of law, civil law, penal law, and it's not the same categories. So it's important to have those categories, but the more complex the law is, the more difficult it is to actually mobilize these protections because you're not necessarily aware of them and you do not necessarily identify to those categories. Which also is a way, so there's something on passing, obviously, but it's also a way to question a very conservative trope on minorities, to say minorities have gained power. So I really work here on, based on a good number of social work in social psychology to make a distinction between influence and power. Second challenge, the question of numbers. Because obviously, as you've understood probably, being a minority or part of a minority group is not just about numbers, obviously. It's a question of a relationship of domination. But it doesn't mean that numbers do not matter, obviously. The way, if you are black in South America, you are a majority in terms of numbers, but it doesn't mean that in terms of power relations, you are not a minority. So it is important to take into account that if you're dominated at 40% of the population or 0.05%, it's definitely not the same form of domination. I look at different modalities of representing minorities. I won't talk about that, but one important point is the impact of algorithms as well, because the question of number is not just it's not just the law of the greatest number. Now being a minority is also being governed by the, I'm not sure I will have the vocabulary in English, but I'll try, by a sort of new law, the law of averages in a way. That is to say, what average behavior is expected from you. As you know, if you use a word like, which I can use with friends online, let's say PD, which means queer, fag, or something. I'm very happy to use it. For me, it's a very loving term that I can use with my friends. But of course, what's going to be Facebook answer? Censor, because it doesn't have the ability to understand this deviation from average behavior. So it's a new challenge. Counter minority, it's the topic of a previous book as well, but the way conservative groups claim to be minorities themselves to better attack minority rights. In France, in the streets, in the US, a lot before courts. I'm happy to give you many examples, but you probably already know many of them. And affirmative actions, it's a chapter that compares the possible competition between minority groups before the law, and I mentioned that a little bit already. Now, I try to have three answers to that by rethinking the notion of presence based on the work of Jean-Luc Nancy, a French philosopher, who really discussed what he called co-appearance, the fact that we appear on the social stage with others. And by thinking this was the starting point was the Grant case, which I presented at the beginning, law in a more analogical way, but I will say a few words about that. And then the question of minority universalism, that is to say, what kind of ethics can emerge from these resonances. So I won't have time to say more about that, but look at that. It's a piece by Zoe Leonard, where analogy is clearly conceived as not a comparison in a way, but rather having different recurrences thought in parallel. And that's really what's happening right now, especially before a European court. So I'm going to be, there's a lot, but I'm going to be synthetic here. Law requires comparisons. If you want to prove a discrimination, you have to prove a difference of treatment. To prove a difference of treatment, you have to compare person A and person B, which means that person B is somehow centrally, normatively central. So you recreate a form of hierarchy in the very act where you try actually to recognize a discriminated group or person. First problem. Second problem, Kimberly Crenshaw in her work on intersectionality, so I imagine you're all familiar with intersectionality, but when you are at the intersection of different identities and discriminations, She explained that it's a dynamic, that it's not just a cumulative effect. However, if you have many, many criteria at the same time, eventually it becomes more difficult to prove, to evidence discrimination. If you have 10 criteria at the same time, how can you compare two cases? So in this decision, the European Court of Justice actually said, well, we will only look at one criteria, try to examine it, but in the light of as informed by other cases of discrimination regarding other criteria. So it's also a way to make other forms of discrimination resonate in one given form of discrimination. So this is the sort of, it's not a comparison, it's an analogy. I will say a little bit more about these cases very briefly. Of course, analogies have almost always existed or at least for the past almost a century in the US, for one single reason, is that race was first protected and then gender and so on and so forth. So there were always analogies driven from race, and given the centrality of race in American history, this is a continuing phenomenon. A limit to that is that you also take the risk of vampirizing the group, which is the group with which an analogy is driven. That is to say, this is what Janet Halley, the lawyer, a professor of law, explains as the like race argument. The risk is actually to consider racial discrimination, for instance, as similar to sexist discrimination or ableist discrimination. So the point here is not to consider that they are similar, but they are singular, they have their specificities. However, the impact that they have on people also teaches us a lot about other forms of discrimination and the impact that they can have on people, which has completely, this is a case with a resonance between age and sexism, which has completely extended the protection of people in European law. For example, in this case, it's somebody who had an accident, and the protection of people facing disability was used to protect a person who had just a temporary disability, in a way. By association as well, aka if you take care of somebody who has a disability, you are impacted as well. You are discriminated against as well. So it's a case where somebody who was the father of a young daughter, and he was taking care of her, and he didn't benefit from a specific tax discount. And this was defined by the judge as a discrimination based on disability, even if he was not himself in a situation of disability. Contextual discrimination. If it's a case of violence, domestic violences against women. And in that case, Russia was condemned for not creating not creating the conditions in terms of public policies to protect women against domestic violence. So it went way beyond individual discrimination. In that case, the Czech Republic had against Rome population a policy that didn't orient the kids towards the best schools. So again, the judge considered that it was the prejudice itself which was discriminatory, even if it did, in other words, it didn't have to focus on specific cases to evidence discrimination. Declaratory, it's the boss of the head of a soccer club, which had all kind of homophobic statements, and the judge recognized that it had an impact, sort of a reverberation on people, even if potential gay players or lesbian players were not directly discriminated against. Inertial discrimination, it's another case in terms of police violence, where there was not in that case, it's Bulgaria was condemned for not having done what was necessary to evidence a police discrimination. So they were basically a discrimination happened, and they did nothing to try and prove that there was discrimination. So this sort of resonances had expanded considerably the protection of minorities. I'd be happy to answer questions about the core of the book, which is the question of minority universalism. But maybe let me end with this very famous letter by Zoe Leonard. Again, I want to die for president, I want a person with AIDS for president, and I want a fag for vice president, and I want a person and I want someone with no health insurance, and I want someone who grew up in a place where the earth is so saturated with toxic waste that they did not have a choice about getting leukemia, and so on and so forth. What she explains here, and I promise this will be my conclusion, is that, if I find it, yes. She does not attribute any moral superiority to minorities, but sees that their position in relations of domination can transform the exercise of political power. That this position can be transformative is not because it is distinct from that of the majority, nor even because it is marginal, dominated, or vulnerable. That's why I have a strong criticism of care theories. Theories that essentialize positionality leads to dead ends. They give free rein to the moral relativism on which the extreme right feeds. What motivates minority perspectives, as shown here, and what I support, is multi-positionality. Because they are raised and evolve in majority cultures, minorities speak several languages, circulate among several social backgrounds, and learn to constantly endorse and disavow their identities. And this dynamic can be the starting point. Doesn't mean that it is always the starting point, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. Can be the starting point for an ethic of presence that pluralizes the relationship to social space and political time. It is not based on any intrinsic quality, but arises from de-centering. Let me end here because I could speak on forever, and that's not the point. I'm happy to have questions from you.
Wonderful. So I believe we have about 10 minutes for questions.
And please don't feel intimidated. I spoke in English, so you are most of you are in a majority position vis-à-vis me, so yes.
How does the consideration of capitalism
Okay, should I take several questions at the same time or answer?
It's up to you.
No, it's you're the host, so it depends on.
I would say like, why don't you take one at a time?
One at a time. Okay. Thank you very much for this. So let me show you the architecture of the book up right here. So this is something I didn't mention that I take into account when I discuss the different modalities where violence is embodied, le corps de la violence, and also the question of relationship to memory. I do that by tackling the question of minority struggle themselves. One way to articulate different minority struggles, including anti-capitalist movements, with other, like let's say, anti-homophobic movements, anti-ableist movements, and so on and so forth. One of the ways to think about, to sort of consider them together is to talk in terms of convergence. This idea that if there is almost a sort of natural convergence of minority struggles. The problem of this approach, which is very much prominent in France, The problem of this approach is that it minimizes the possible contradictions and conflict between different minority struggles, one. There's, of course, always the question of who is the spokesperson and so on and so forth. And it tends to actually weaken some struggles in the name of more important struggles, and usually the question of anti-capitalism. Another approach is to look at them in terms of coalition. So I try also to examine coalitions since the 60s, obviously, the Rainbow Coalition. A sociologist at Princeton, Dara Strolovich, showed something very interesting, is that she studied hundreds of organizations, is that when you have a coalition of organizations, the minorities within the minority, so to speak, have to do the work themselves. It's always the case, even if there is a goodwill to be in coalition with others, at the end of the day, sort of the most concretely organization is based on the fact that if you are dominated based on many, many criteria, for instance, eventually you'll have to do the work yourself, you'll have less resources and so on and so forth. Another approach, which is that of Comité Adama, which I mentioned earlier, is what I call parallax. I won't say more about that, but the idea that we have to admit conflicts between minority groups and minority struggles, conflict with some issues, other issues such as capitalism, but that the energy given to one given struggle and the victories received by one given struggle also give strength to others. Even if there are contradictions, even if it doesn't necessarily push towards the same direction. Yes, let me end here because there are many other questions, but I'd be happy to discuss further this question. Yes.
When you spoke of the veil of ignorance, and you talked
Yes.
about the book that critiqued it, that obviously you named your book
Yes.
Justice, were you specifically saying that you think, I guess in your opinion, is the ideal of the veil of ignorance that is insufficient, or just the way that it's advocated in the face of like systematic injustices?
No, I think it is insufficient for one given reason, is that obviously it's too speculative to be convincing. And also it almost leads to supporting the arguments of conservative groups by saying we also are under a veil of ignorance, we also are dominated in different ways, so we need to be protected for that. And what I try to do by using the notion of injustice rather than the notion of justice is that injustice means that there is a materiality to discrimination, and this materiality cannot just be erased discursively. So in that case, also this is something we discussed earlier, but let's say you have a group which is against gay marriage, and they say, well, I'm being discriminated because this is against my conception of society. But how do you evidence this discrimination? Nothing is removed from them. So there is no discrimination in that case. So they cannot claim to be in a situation where they should be protected. So what I try to do, like Walser, is to have a more grounded approach to the many experiences of injustice. And like him, I think it's still important to pay attention to different experiences of injustices and not to approach it in a too transversal way. Because that's also one characteristic of globalization as well, is that even if our destinies are tied in many ways, what I wear, what I eat, it depends on the work of other people. And this chain of interdependence, as sociologist Norbert Elias explained, is longer and longer and longer. However, my loyalty, my knowledge as well, is also limited to certain relationships, certain spaces. So we can have a sort of broad idea of a veil of ignorance, or for the care theories, a veil of vulnerability, for instance. But at the end of the day, we don't care or we don't pay attention to this person, that other person in the same way. And I think it's unavoidable, and I try to be as realistic as possible and take that into account, but then try to connect these different forms of connection to different people. I would say two things. The first one is that obviously when there is an extension of systems of protection of people, it gives also more visibility to their struggle, and obviously we are more aware of the situation or this or that group. That's for sure. Which means that the key in legal terms is to always be as adaptive as possible. Because when you protect a person or a group of person with a specific system, you know that this system will be under attack. So the key is to always have, like, I don't know how to say that in English, but I will say it in French, but un coup d'avance. That is to say, you do some, you know that you have to have, how would you translate un coup d'avance? It's impossible to say that. You always have to anticipate, basically, the next step. And to be critical of the very system that you use to protect people. Because if not, they might sort of encapsulate people in a way that might not help them any longer, because it will make them also a target, because they are more identified by the very system that protect them. Now, what has changed as well is that under these circumstances, the movements against minority rights are very much organized, and in a way that didn't happen 10, 15 years ago, with different circumstances in different countries. They use different registers. Anti-Americanism in France, in Brazil, for instance, it's very much connected to evangelist movements. In Eastern Europe, it can be an anti-European discourse. In Italy, it's another, and so on and so forth. But they have very strong connections. They exchange expertise, money circulates, so there is an entire globalized movement as well that might explain also what you're talking about. So my book in French was called "Who's Afraid of Queer Theory?" because they targeted queer theory as the cause of all problems in France. Judith Butler just finished, and it will be published in 3 weeks, a book called "Who's Afraid of Gender?" And I think that very much answers your question. Thank you, Judith.
I think we have time for one last question.
And we have more time afterwards, so I'm happy to discuss with you.
I was curious whether your research involved looking at minority groups oppressing other minority
Yes,
groups,
yes.
as you mentioned in your research about, for example,
Yes.
Asian Americans.
Yes.
Black Lives Matter movement. I also immediately remembered how in Los Angeles in
Yes.
the 80s or 90s there was massive conflict between Korean Americans and
Yes.
whether you're
Yes, yes, absolutely. I didn't mention that. It was part of my conclusion, but it's a very important point indeed. That's why I talk about an ethical promise or ethical potential that emerge from a minority form of relationship to others. In that case, I wouldn't say that a minority group is in a minority relation to others, but rather a majority form of relation to others. A moment when you think that as a minority, being a minority is face a situation of non-sovereignty. It means that you are spoken even before being able to speak. It means that people identify you sometimes even before you're aware of your own identity and so on and so forth. So either you want to restore your sovereignty, to control everything, and when you do that, you tend to do that at the expense of other groups. Or you actually accept this form of non-sovereignty, but do something productive out of it. That is to say, to make it an opportunity to be connected to others, to embellish it. If you think about literature, for instance, Jean Genet, Notre-Dame des Fleurs, it's only about embellishing a form of domination that the characters experience. So this is what I argue for as an ethical promise or potential, but it certainly doesn't mean that it's a propriety or characteristic, ontologic or inherent to being part of a minority group. There's almost if not, it would be quite absurd on my part to think about that. If you look at the Rassemblement National, so the extreme right political party in France, there are many gay men in the highest, councils of the Rassemblement National. So they advocate for policies which are discriminatory against themselves. And they argue, even Marine Le Pen during the last presidential debate, she said that which was absolutely not true in terms of policy, but she was supportive of women, of gay rights, to better target migrants, for instance, and better target Muslims as well. So when I talk about an ethical potential, it almost goes against this grain, but the ethical potential also means that it can also be carried by people who are not in the majority group, but develop a minority form of relation to others by witnessing the discrimination that minority groups face.
Wonderful. I think the time has come to thank you.
Thank you very much.